Hi, friends. Yes, we're still technically on hiatus for the rest of the year, but the episode that was posted on my other podcast, Diversity and Inclusion Revolution or Reform, with Amber Hikes, the Director of Equity, Belonging, Inclusion, and Diversity at the ACLU, had some heavy restorative justice themes, so I wanted to put this in the feed. If you enjoy this episode, check out all the other conversations Connie and I have with DEI practitioners, academics, scholars, and advocates over on the Diversity and Inclusion Revolution or Reform feed. Enjoy.
Welcome to today's episode of Diversity and Inclusion, Revolution or Reform, where we talk all things D&I to ask whether D&I can save us, get us free, or move us towards collective liberation. I'm Connie.
And I'm David. Each week on this podcast, we'll get into whether D&I is revolution or reform with guests who are D&I practitioners, activists, organizers, or academics and researchers in the field.
We talk strategy, mindsets, growth, learnings, and mistakes, and even some juicy D&I confessions, because at the end of each day, we're all humans just trying to do our best.
All right, welcome back to this week's episode of Diversity and Inclusion, Revolution or Reform. We are so thrilled to have the legendary Amber Hikes join us in conversation today. Amber is a social justice advocate, community organizer, and unapologetic queer Black woman. She currently serves as the ACLU's first Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer, but has roots in community organizing and activism, social work, and youth development. You might also know her as a person responsible for putting the black and brown stripes on the rainbow LGBTQ pride flag, but no matter where she's been, no matter what community she's working with, she's always pushing for equity and justice, and that's why we're so excited to talk with her today. Amber, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, y'all. I am so thrilled about this conversation. You have no idea.
We are really excited to have you, and your bio is super extensive. We could spend the hour just reading and sharing with our listeners.
Let's not, please. Really, let's not.
But we would like to start by asking you to share the lineage of your work in diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, community organizing, however you want to take that question. We just love to hear about your lineage of your work.
Oh my gosh. Okay. That's not one that I get a whole lot, but I'd love to talk about that. So as you all said, currently Chief Equity and Inclusion Officer at the ACLU. And in that role, I provide the vision, the leadership, the kind of direction for our nationwide strategy to support equity, diversity, and inclusion across all aspects of our work and efforts internally. I would say that I heard once that if you can't explain what you do to like a kindergartner, then you're getting it wrong. So I sometimes try to check myself and say, can I talk about this with a 5-year-old? And so over and over again, what it comes down to is that I work to make sure that people feel like they belong at work, like we see them, we value them, we care about them. And there is a lot of strategy and policy and sophistication behind how I do that. But at the end of the day, that's what I do. So that's what I do now. But I did spend the first decade of my career in education access work for underrepresented first generation low income students who are in West Philly, Philadelphia, and in Compton and Long Beach in California. And before I joined the ACLU, I was the executive director of the Office of LGBT Affairs for the city of Philadelphia. I got to do a lot of policy for Philadelphia, and that job that was replicated in cities kind of across the country, and did a lot of work with our communities to make sure that we had more equitable housing and education and create spaces where LGBTQ Philadelphians felt like they belonged in the city. So that's like a very quick kind of look at the equity work. But what's been really interesting about doing this is that I've done it across a lot of different sectors, which I think has been particularly helpful in how I approach equity work now at a major social justice nonprofit, but doing equity work at a higher ed institution, doing it in government, doing it in nonprofits, right? Doing it with community organizing work, all very different. And of course, I've never done it in a corporate setting because that's not necessarily how I'm oriented, but that is a very different way to do equity, diversity, inclusion work as well. So that's something that I pull on every day because I think those different lenses help you come up with really creative solutions to historically challenging problems. So that's the quick version of how I got here.
Thank you for sharing that. I was reading and researching about your work, and I just have so much respect for all that you do, because there's just so much generosity and expansiveness in just the different sectors and even the people that you work with. And I think you just passed 2 years at the ACLU as a Chief Equity Inclusion Officer.
Correct.
2 years.
2 years, 20 years, 220. It depends on the day. But no, yeah, it has been 2 years. Yes, we made it to the 2-year mark.
That's incredible in a lot of ways, because I know it probably is not easy being the first in this role at the ACLU, being in-house. And ACLU has been around since the 1920s, which means
That's right.
You're up against a lot in terms of systems, cultural norms, and values.
If I could say something about that. So it has been 2 years, and the 2 years that it's been is also really significant, right? The ACLU, you already mentioned, been around for 101 years. But I think what's important is that a lot of folks started knowing about the ACLU in the last 4 or 5 years, right? Because we were really fighting very hard against the Trump administration and really trying to defend civil liberties and civil rights, as so many other organizations were. But I think at the end of the Trump administration, I think the counter was that we had sued that administration over 400 times, right? And so 400 times in 4 years is a lot of litigation and a lot of lawsuits, but all obviously in the name to try to hold up the civil liberties that we have and really continue to hold government, and American government in particular, accountable to her promises, right? Which is super important. So those particular 2 years have been really challenging ones for the organization. And it's a challenging time to try to take care of the folks on the inside who are doing so much incredible work on the outside. So thank you for acknowledging that. But yes, it is still a 101-year-old organization. And I say all the time, it's like steering a 101-year-old like tanker, right? Which has its own challenges for sure.
So your 2 years is really like 10 years. Like
that's right. That's
really
what I'm saying. 220. Who's counting?
Even within the construction of the role, right? What stood out to me when I first became aware of you and your work in this role specifically, right? You know, there's so many acronyms that get thrown around in this space, whether it's JEDI, EDIB, DEI, D&I. Like, your role is equity and inclusion. No diversity in there. Talk about the construction of that. Why is equity first? Why is inclusion there? Why are some things missing?
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad you asked this question. So this is a funny, and I don't think you know this story. This is a funny story. My very first day, I should say, when I was headhunted for the position. I didn't apply for the position, but when I talked to the headhunter or the recruiter about it, it was a chief diversity officer position. And so I interviewed under that title, accepted the job under that title. And then the very first day, I was like, so to the executive director, so can we talk about this diversity thing? Let's be clear. I'm not against diversity. Let that not be the headline of this, is that Amber Hikes hates diversity. I'm not against diversity, but the ACLU doesn't necessarily have a diversity problem. We really have kind of an embarrassment of riches when it comes to quote unquote diversity. Where we need to be leaning in, and all of us need to be leaning in, is around equity, inclusion, belonging, and I would even, push us towards justice, right? So let's drop the diversity. Let's drop that piece. Not to say it's done, right? But just to de-emphasize and make very clear that we are leaning into the equity and inclusion components of it. And so I said, I could be a chief equity officer. He was fine with that, except of course the acronym would have been CEO, which he was not. He was not terribly fine with that, which fair. So we landed on CEIO. So that's where the equity inclusion piece came in. And I joke about it, but it was really important for me to make it clear as truly one of my first actions as the equity and inclusion officer, to be clear about where our work was going to be leaning and who we were going to be centering in that work, right? And I feel I don't want to say something terribly controversial right here at the top, but diversity, depending on how you lean into it, is really a cop-out. And it can be a cop-out, right? It's about who's checking some boxes, making sure that we have the right people at the table, but not actually meaningfully contributing in the work that we're doing or the decisions that we're making. And that's just not the work that I came to the ACLU to do. And it was not my understanding that that's the work that they wanted me to do. So I said, let's just be really explicit about this from the outset. And I think we've been better for it.
Yeah, like diversity for diversity's sake, right? Like, are we including people from quote unquote diverse backgrounds into our systems of white supremacy, right? Right. Like, even the origins of the word diversity, like one of the first like uses in Latin, right, was from a papal bull, like Dum Diversas, right, where it's about like, hey, let us diversify our empire by bringing in slave labor from Africa.
Wow,
right?
talk about
So
it.
like diversity is not really the goal. It's important, it's needed, but like that equity piece is so important. And I know working within that institution that has existed for so many years with so many people who have ascribed, both people of the global majority, right, and white folks ascribe to white supremacy, align themselves with white supremacy to get to the positions that they're in, where they're fighting for, upholding the Constitution, which has served a lot of people and has not served so many in a lot of different ways. And so like, what are we doing? What was your calculation in coming into this role, like with all the complications of this organization?
Yeah, I think that's what's so fascinating to me about the ACLU, and something that continues to be, I guess, shocking. It's really shocking to me. It's inspiring on most days, to be totally frank. And what I mean is this idea that we use the Constitution, which in so many ways is a white supremacist document, and we use it to fight for, protect, and even expand the civil liberties and civil rights of folks who have been historically marginalized in this country. And that's a deeply aspirational goal when you think about it. And it's something that, I mean, I would argue we've been doing quite well for a while. And it's something that I believe a lot in when we get it right, but it's not an easy task. And on some days it's challenging. I find myself and talking to my colleagues about this all the time, saying, is this something that's actually possible? Right? It's, in a lot of ways, you're trying to dismantle the master's house with his own tools. And of course, Audre Lorde reminds us that we can't do that. And so it's an interesting project, right? It's an interesting, not unlike this whole project of democracy, right? It's an interesting experiment. I'm glad that we're engaging, right? I'm really glad that we are doing the work that we're doing, and we're serving the people that we're serving, and doing so much of this with our partners and stakeholders who are on the ground doing this work as well. But it is deeply aspirational, and it's an experiment. And so I'm not quite sure. I know that we win our cases, right? And we win our wins in our legislative victories, right? We absolutely do that work. But the way that democracy just works in general is that it's a democracy if you can keep it. And so we say all the time, and one of our founders, Roger Baldwin, would say that these cases don't stay won, right? You have to continue to come back. You have to continue to fight. And we know this just about liberation work in general. And so it's a tool. It's absolutely a tool, but we are constantly kind of evaluating and analyzing whether it's the best tool. It's certainly not the only tool. And if you can really use a white supremacist tool to fight white supremacy, we'll see.
I love hearing that, partly because I think that our nation state, the United States of America, is itself a project that is this experiment that we haven't really fully lived through, and we keep coming up against harm. So if we can experiment with anti-Black racism, white supremacy, I think we can also experiment with what it looks like to have racial justice and racial healing be part of that future world building, right? So I love that response that you share. Can we talk about free speech for a second? I'm sure you get that question a lot.
Nope, never heard of it. No, who is she?
And I want to share that when I was younger, because I've always been a social justice person. As young as I can remember, working at ACLU was my dream. And I was like, I don't want to be a lawyer, so I don't know what I would do for the ACLU. But of course, as I grew older and started to see more complexities, sit with more complexities, I was like, oh, ACLU, there's some tensions there with how it positions itself as kind of like a free speech defender, being content neutral. And so I'm curious about how you interpret being in that role as a chief equity and inclusion officer, given that free speech is often weaponized against marginalized identity people, against people who are vulnerable, quote unquote, against people who are facing a lot of inequitable and systemic barriers. So how do you navigate that with how free speech is weaponized often?
I will say this, there is not a conversation in the ACLU that is discussed more frequently than this conversation. And that's a healthy thing. That's a wonderful thing. The ACLU is filled with folks like you that have dreamed of working at the ACLU, or not necessarily attorneys. I'm not an attorney either, and have really looked up to so much of the incredible work of the ACLU and is often challenged by much of the historical work of the ACLU. And so I'll just mention, just for folks who I didn't expect to talk so much about the ACLU today, but I'm glad I have an opportunity to, for folks who may not be as familiar, like maybe they're familiar with some of the work that we've done, more recently, like in the last 5 years, but folks may not know Roe v. Wade, ACLU, Brown versus Board, ACLU, Miranda rights, like those ACLU. There's so many, Loving versus Virginia, folks. So ACLU. So these landmark kind of Supreme Court cases that we look to as these really important points for some of the civil liberties and civil rights that we still enjoy and earned today really were ACLU cases back then. But what's important to note is, yes, and everybody knows Skokie, right? Everybody also knows what happened in Charlottesville just a few years ago, right? And so we constantly talk about these tensions. And what I think has been challenging for those of us who do equity work, and particularly racial equity work, are the ways that free speech is pitted against racial justice work. And so often there's that conversation, right? And so what many of us inside the organization would say, as we're kind of pushing the organization to be accountable to its own values, is, can you be a racial justice organization and defend the rights of white supremacists to use white supremacist speech, right? That's the conversation that we have constantly. And to have this conversation with some of the most brilliant legal scholars in the country, right? And to have this conversation with some of the most brilliant racial justice scholars, and to have this conversation with some of the most incredible organizers, right? On the ground kind of activists. It's an embarrassment of riches to be able to have this. What I will say is that we don't have clean answers to this, right? As I'm clearly demonstrating by just telling you how frequently these brilliant minds are having this conversation. We don't have clear answers, but what I will say is that our free speech, privacy, and technology legal team, with the folks that do that work, and our racial justice team are constantly in lockstep. And what these folks have decided to do with their work, and they will speak openly about this, is that we know that free speech, if we start to limit speech in any way, and we do this from a legal context, right? We start to sanction folks' speech, and we're able to do it with the law. The way that's going to be applied disproportionately is going to impact Black and brown communities. Point blank, period. We see it all the time. So the first people who are going to get shut down are protesters, right? They're going to be folks that are more radical, more progressive, the folks who are trying to hold police departments accountable, right? Folks who are really fighting for racial justice. Those are the ones that are going to bear the brunt of that kind of cracking down around speech, because again, we're talking about white supremacist documents that are going to be able to hold up white supremacy. And so when our speech, privacy, and technology folks talk about the slippery slope, they're saying it doesn't even have to get that slippery. It goes immediately there, and that disproportionate impact is going to fall on our communities. So holding this line around free speech is holding the line for our communities. So it's an interesting point. That said, still really complicated. And a lot of the conversation internally is like, sure, but could we just defend Nazis less? Right? So fine, but also less cases with Nazis, maybe, which of course we certainly have done. So it's a robust, lively conversation. But I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah. And I think as you were talking, this comes up with some of our other guests when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, the umbrella work, is that it's really harm reduction work, right? So even thinking about free speech as defending the line, we're actually thinking about harm reduction, because the first and most disproportionate impact are going to be communities of color, just as you mentioned. Can I ask, and you don't have to answer this, where do you, Amber, as an individual stand when it comes to, because I know that people put professional hats and some people are kind of merged together. You might be in that way, but kind of where do you come in on free speech and having to navigate some of the complexities and tensions within ACLU in your role at such a national, high profile position?
So this is going to get super meta. The great thing about working at the ACLU is I don't have to worry about getting in trouble talking about free speech. How nice is that? That's not how that works, which is lovely. And I know that that's a privilege for sure. So where do I come in? I come in on that kind of that last joke that I made about yes, and also less Nazis, please, because I feel like we can. Again, this is back to the kind of aspirational idea of using the Constitution, using the law to be able to defend the folks that the law was actually built to continue to disenfranchise. I feel like we can uphold those free speech rights and we can be more judicious about the kinds of cases that we take, especially because the ACLU has a long history of defending folks who have been oppressed and have been targeted by our government, right? And folks who in particular are marginalized communities. And so the argument that many of us made during the Trump administration, right, is that the power dynamics here are very different than perhaps they were in Skokie, right? Although we could argue that, right? I'm just going to use Skokie as an example, though. When we were talking about the white supremacist language coming out of the White House and the white supremacy being fueled by the highest office in the land, when we're looking at that kind of power context, the ACLU needs to make a different kind of assessment. We need to make a different assessment around who's in power, who needs our help right now, and what does it really mean because our whole point is making sure that we are holding government accountable. So when government is the one that is in the bully pulpit and using the white supremacist language to oppress others, then our calculation needs to be different, right? And so I think that's what's really important about this analysis is that the law is not static and stagnant in that particular way, right? It's flowing. And so we need to be flexible and flowing as well, recognizing the context that's around us. And so again, like as a racial justice practitioner, understanding that if we start to limit speech, our people are going to be the ones that are impacted. I recognize that. I can hold that truth along with, can we have an analysis of the context at the time and then pool our resources and put our resources to the communities that are most impacted and most in need.
Yeah, that is so beautiful, being able to hold those two things at once, right? Because the world is not binary. When I think about, characteristics of white supremacy culture, like that either or thinking, like we can be able to hold these two truths at once, like also thinking about characteristics of white supremacy culture, worship of the written word, which is literally the Constitution and all of the laws, right? And so like, how are we making it work for both people in community and people like inside organizations? I think like the role of inclusion, equity, diversity folks who exist in-house is so challenging, right? Because you're both working internally to create that work environment that is equitable, just, where people can feel a sense of belonging and celebration, and also putting those values out into the world through people who may or may not have those leanings when they came into those spaces. Being able to hold those two truths at the same time is a lot of work. I know you are not the only person within the ACLU who is working to do this. Can you talk about how your team is working internally so it will have external impact?
Oh, absolutely. I'd be thrilled to. And I because we've mentioned white supremacy several times here. It's a nice first 10 minutes here. But since we mentioned that, and we also mentioned white supremacy culture, I actually want to just give a little bit of context. So like we said, I came in 2 years ago, and right after changing my title, the first thing that I did was start making an assessment around what kind of education we were going to do, kind of internal education we were going to do for the organization. And I think this is like a very important first step for a D&I practitioner, right? We have to understand the kind of context that we're walking into, be able to do all of our research and download what's been done, but make an assessment about where the organization is, right? What's the culture? What's the climate? And for me, what I was figuring out was, so I have this 101-year-old organization. At the time, it was 99, but it was 99-year-old organization. It's a legal organization. So we already know David, you already kind of intimated like all the challenges with that particular profession. It's a legal organization, but at the same time, it's a social justice nonprofit, which has its own kind of context, right? And it's a nationwide nationwide, not national, nationwide organization, which is different, right? We have 4 national offices and then we have these 54 affiliates, right? So naming that because the needs of the ACLU of New York are very different from the ACLU of Arkansas, child. And you got to figure out how to, so many dynamics. And you're doing all of this in the context of the Trump administration, right? Which is truly the most embattled that the organization has ever been since 9/11, 2001. So, oh my gracious. The other thing that I want to add to this is because of what we affectionately call the Trump bump, which was the need that the organization had to scale up in order to fight the Trump administration. Because of that, the organization doubled in size in a matter of like 3 years, right? So the organization went from like 250 to 500 people. And now we're about a 600 pound, we're like a 600 person gorilla. All of this. And of course, the doubling in size was BIPOC folks, LGBTQ folks, a lot more women, right? Non-binary folks. Like it was wild. And so and much, much, much younger folks than have ever worked at the ACLU. So you have this massive influx of folks who are here to fight this administration, hold up civil liberties, and you have a clash of cultures, obviously. So coming in, trying to create cultures of belonging with all of these dynamics is really challenging. But I give you all of that context to say that the first thing was we need common language and understanding, even when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, just the definitions for those words. But even beyond that, am I going to come in during this time and do like implicit bias training? And no shade to anybody that's doing implicit bias training. That's really important. So is like, microaggressions training, super important. Your basic diversity 101. Yep. All of that. But I said, you know what? No. We got to do anti-oppression training, and we've got to specifically look at dismantling white supremacy culture. And I know that there's going to be a whole camp over here that's like, yes, absolutely, run that ball down the field. And there's going to be a massive camp over here, kind of our legacy ACLUers that are going to say, you are coming at every single thing that I built my entire career on. This is back to David's point about worship of the written word. That's a legal kind of standard, right? That's like the entire field. We're Supreme Court litigators, right? You're saying that the written word is trash. You're saying that this is a problem. You're saying that perfectionism is a problem. Perfectionism is how we win Supreme Court cases. So it was a lot of work, but even just introducing the concept of white supremacy culture and the ways that it harms all of us, even that was a battle, was a challenge, was still is an ongoing conversation. But it was important for me, and I think this is a note, and this is where I'll kind of end, a note for D&I practitioners. It was important. I knew I was going to get backlash no matter what I did. So why am I half-stepping, right? If we're going to get pushback and I'm going to get argued down about implicit bias training, then hell, let's just go ahead and do white supremacy culture. You could argue me down. Maybe you'll back by the time I talk about implicit bias. You're like, oh yeah, that feels reasonable. So I think there's a lesson there in go ahead and do the thing because they're gonna litigate it anyway. So don't water down your message, right? Just go all the way out. They'll water you down anyway. Don't half step. Don't cut yourself off if you don't have to.
Amber, it's like you read my mind because I was about to ask you, like what's an advice you would give to yourself back then, having gone through these 2 years. And because most of our listeners are DEI practitioners who I think run into similar challenges on a much smaller scale, not working kind of at a nationwide level. But I know for the clients that I work with, and even in my consulting work, I'm always like, what is your common language, right? What is the organizing principle and vision around diversity, equity, and inclusion work? And most people are like, we define diversity very differently. I'm like, okay, that's your number one problem there to get started. So I love what you said about not watering it down because people are going to fight and resist anyway, right? So go hard, throw shade at implicit bias, which I do often and get called in for, but I don't mind it. So I'm curious now, as we're kind of wrapping up the conversation, you've had such an incredible journey and lineage through diversity, equity, inclusion work, community organizing. Are there any, and this doesn't have to be in the context of ACLU, but are there any tensions that you're grappling with when it comes to DEI work, right? Or EDI, as you all call it, like in the current movements and moments that we're in now? Like, are there anything that you're sitting with, grappling with?
Yeah. Let me, what I'll start with, the first thing that's coming up there's a few things I think are interconnected, right? So the first thing that's coming up is doing this work in movement space, which I think I'll just talk about really what my team and I are grappling with so often is doing this work, whether it's at a national nonprofit or it's doing it in your like 10-person organizing collective, right? Which I have experience in both, is the ways that we, and I should have said kind of at the top, I'm a social worker, right? So I come from, that's my orientation, kind of how I come to this work, the ways that we call each other forward, right? The way that we do this work, help each other grow and build without shutting each other down and burning folks out from liberation work and movement work. And so it's kind of to pull on Adrienne Maree Brown's "We Will Not Cancel Us," right? I think it's like such an important and kind of timely reminder. What I'm seeing happen in so many spaces is just really a lack of kind of grace, humility, understanding, and even kind of personal accountability in this work that's really, really challenging from where I sit. And I have a lot of hypotheses around why that's coming up so much, I feel like, in movement space. But aside from really the origins of it, what I'm concerned about really is the result and the end game here. And I talk to my deputy and I talk to my teams about this all the time. I'm constantly saying, right, so like, what's the end game? If we continue down this road of, if someone makes this mistake, if someone speaks out of turn, if someone stumbles here and we cast them aside, we throw them away, and they are our people, right? They are here, right? They are our folks. What's the end game? What is the plan for the movement if that's the way that we are going to engage with folks? And I want to be very clear. I'm not talking about folks who are kind of consistent abusers. I'm not talking about like folks who are just like intentionally violent and harmful to our communities. I'm talking about folks that deserve call-ins, folks that make missteps, and we are so easy to kind of cast them off, to jump down their throats, to throw them aside. We are losing folks for our movement. And even beyond that, we are burning our people out to the extent that I have seen so many folks kind of not walk away from liberation work entirely, but really take breaks, like significant breaks that I'm all here for breaks, but breaks that don't necessarily bring them back into the work in the ways that they were before. And so I get concerned about how sustainable it is for us to engage with each other the way that we have been. So that's kind of like the biggest point that I think that I've been really contending with. Something that's adjacent to that are some of the generational differences that we're seeing, right? So I'm an elder millennial. I can go ahead and out myself there. I'm a very elder millennial, and I am very fortunate to be surrounded by Gen Zers. And I pretty much exclusively hire Gen Zers and Gen wires. Is that right? and those folks are constantly not just challenging my thinking, but leading my thinking. I defer to these folks to lead us, because I truly think that they're the ones that can tell us what liberation is really supposed to look like. But there are some serious generational challenges that I'm seeing that are playing out in the workplace and also playing out in our movement spaces that are making it difficult for us to have fruitful conversations where we're coming up with solutions that are going to be efficient, they're going to be effective, and are going to get us where we need to go. There are so many factions. And when I look at our opponents, when I look at conservatives, they have like never had these problems, it feels like, and they still don't have these problems, perhaps because they're not particularly interested in democratic decision-making or consensus. That certainly helps, I can imagine. But I worried about how divisive we are and how it hamstrings us from being able to be successful. And so I see those fissures and those factions happening more often around generational differences, certainly other identities as well, as we have seen throughout history. But now it's so much around generational differences, and folks on all these sides kind of just throwing their hands up and walking away and saying, those people are completely unreasonable. And then everyone leaving the table, and we're left with, again, nothing. So not to make it sound all gloom and doom, but these are the things that I'm contending with. And this is specifically within our progressive spaces, folks who are doing liberation work or political work and are trying really hard to get us to this next step. But it's these, I don't want to say infighting, but it's these internal tensions that I think are having more significant impacts than we are willing to acknowledge.
Yeah, and I think, like, speaking to the two parts of what you just said, right, I think with conservative folks in general, right, they are trying to hold on to something that it already exists, right? And so like, what are the things that we're going to do to make sure that this exists? We're in the space where it's like, there are all these possibilities for justice. And I see the world this way, I see the world this way, and you see the world that way, and Connie sees the world like this totally different way. And like, you know, F you, like, how could you not think about this one thing? How dare you, Amber? Canceled, right? And, you know, that is something that we have to contend with. The reason that I gravitated to you initially is because of the way that you, even in-house within the ACLU, you know, partially from your movement background, your social work background, like have brought this focus of restorative inclusion in parallel to HR, like documentation, worship of the written word, power hoarding processes, right? Restorative inclusion spaces where people can work things out and hold space for each other, right? Your team holding space for folks to share the harm, right? Feel the impact and make changes to move forward together in a good way without saying, nope, that's on your record permanently, right? That's strike against you. No, you're fired, right? But also not ignoring and brushing it to the side. Like, what was the process of bringing that quote unquote program, right? It's more than a program, but the construction of it within those walls.
Oh my gosh. You want to clear out a room? You tell a bunch of litigators that we're going to do a restorative inclusion practice. And it has roots obviously in restorative justice. And this is an indigenous kind of peacemaking practice. And child, you want to clear them out. If you don't get out of my face with this, are we going to have, I've literally had litigators be like, oh, what are you going to do next? And we're going to have us hold hands and sing Kumbaya. What? Like, this is how they felt about this. I'm like, you know what? Maybe if it gets y'all to act right, maybe. I don't know what's wrong with that. Will y'all act right? Maybe. But that just gives you an idea of how maybe differently oriented these folks are. But this was so necessary. And I'm glad you gave me an opportunity to talk about it because I haven't seen it done like internally. I've seen folks kind of, when there's an emergency situation, reach to an external consultant, bring them in to do this thing and kind of band-aid in only when it's a crisis situation. And what we wanted to do is get this in the DNA of our organization and hopefully move from the reactive approach that restorative process so often is to more proactive, right? So to answer your question, David, we actually started with the most reactive, which is a restorative session, right? And so this is mediating through conflict, and it's specifically equity, diversity, inclusion conflict that comes up with folks, to your point, that exists. It's outside of an HR process. And this is what's so important because so often, like, let's go back to microaggressions and implicit bias, right? We know that for folks of directly impacted groups, I would say specifically folks of color, women, trans non-binary folks, right? There are these everyday microaggressions that eat away at these folks' experiences at work. And you swallow them down, you bite it down, and then eventually you say, you know what? This is completely untenable. I'm gone. And maybe you never go to HR about it because you're like, it doesn't really rise to the level of, I need my supervisor to be fired for this, or I'm worried about retaliation, so I don't want to be on the record complaining about this thing. There's all these challenges. Or maybe you're just, the way that your ethics are set up, you're like, I don't necessarily want to engage in this punitive practice where I'm bringing somebody in so that they can engage in this kind of this punitive way of being, this punitive framework. I would really just like to be able to have a conversation about how this thing harmed me, but there's not a pathway for that. And so what we said was, is there a way that we can address this stuff when it comes up, make sure that we are centering the person that's most impacted, leaning into what they want for restoration, right? So maybe that's a conversation. Maybe it's an apology. Maybe you want to be able to come whisper to me about what happened, and you go and are never involved in it. And I go handle that person, pull them into an office and say, just so you know, you misgendered so-and-so and so, and he did it in front of 30 people, so you don't even know who came and told me about it. But here's what you need to go and practice here. You're going to come and see me once an hour every week, and we are going to practice on gender neutral pronouns and whatever it is, right? But just giving folks some options there can actually heal harm when it happens. And even more than that, it helps us be better. So often folks are harming other folks and they have no idea that they did it, because these conversations are really hard to have, because somebody, maybe the person who's harmed doesn't feel comfortable calling you in because there's power dynamics, concerns about retaliation. And the person who did the harm doesn't even have the opportunity to improve and be better. And so likely they'll go into the next room and do the same shit, right? So how can we stop that when it happens? It is, again, deeply aspirational practice, but it has been so incredible. And the gratitude that I have seen specifically, not just from the people who have experienced the harm, but I would say more senior folks who have noticed that they're in a meeting, perhaps, or they're leading a meeting, and there's like that record scratch moment where they've said something and everybody else in the room is like, right? They like energy shifts and nobody calls in the boss about what happens. And so the boss goes in and like, I know something was weird, but then if I reach out and ask about what was weird about it, then it's going to get even more weird. There are now spaces for the people in the space to either say something in the moment or for them to go ahead and shoot an email to me, right? And then I can call that person in. But so often the leader is like, thank you. Thank you. I knew something changed. I didn't know what it was. I just want to make sure that I don't do that again. I don't want to lose the trust of my team. I don't want to have these record scratch moments. I don't want to completely waste a meeting because nobody else can even listen to what I'm saying because this thing happened. So the way that it's been able to really heal culture and be able to build better trust kind of up and down and laterally throughout the organization has been frankly transformative. I don't think it's too much. I don't think it's overstating it to say that. The final thing that I'll say is that's where we started with the most reactive, but we've built all these proactive pieces above it, right? So before you get to a restorative session, there's a difficult conversations training that we do, right? So you can like have this one-on-one conversation that's really hard about this dynamic that happened. And we give you all this coaching and all this training to do that. Before that, there's feedback sessions, right? Before that, we're talking about building psychological safety on teams, right? So there's a whole suite of programs now that are built around this restorative practice. And all of it is about how are we proactively building healthy culture. And when we run into these challenges that come up whenever human beings are involved, right? How can we address it when it happens so the folks who are most marginalized are not continuing to bear the brunt of all of this harm? So that's it in a nutshell. It's new. So give me a little bit more time. I'll tell you how it's going. But so far, so good.
Absolutely. I would just want to cut that. And that's going to be reposted in so many different places because like people really need to hear this as much as DEI work needs to happen, right? Like there's so much in parallel and deeper that we can do in like building these relationships, right? You know, a little bit ago, we were talking to someone who's like, this isn't like diversity, equity, inclusion. This is just like stuff we should be doing, right?
That part.
How are we just in good relationship with each other? And, you know, DEI might be the answer. It might be harm reduction, but, you know, this title of this podcast is, you know, diversity and inclusion, revolution or reform. Where is it for you?
It depends on the day. I'll tell you a secret. I'll tell you all a secret. When I accepted the job at the ACLU, I said this was going to be my last nonprofit job. And I said that because previously, before accepting this job, I had essentially kind of given up on the nonprofit industrial complex. I think I can say that. I had seen that this is for an entirely different podcast, to be totally fair with you. This is like way too long of a story to say here. But I think it's enough to say that I had seen too many of our people coming in to do good work and being harmed by the same systems that they were trying to fight. That's what I'll say in so many different ways, right? Whether that was like horrible workplace practices or just like awful, abysmal pay, even like suffering abuse at the hands of like clients and folks that they're working with, just awful, awful, awful things. I said, I don't know that I believe in this systems, and that's to say nothing about kind of problematic dynamics with funders and donors, right? All of that. And so I said, I don't know that I believe in nonprofits' ability to save us. I don't think that these nonprofits are going to save us, is essentially what I said. I want to be very clear. I'm not saying that the ACLU is going to save us either at all. What I am saying is that I felt like if we can get it right here, we can make a blueprint for getting it right anywhere else. And this will be my kind of like last big shot. If an organization, 101 years old, legal organization, national organization with the resources and the reach of the ACLU, if we can get it right here, we can make a blueprint to get it right anywhere else. Conversely, if we can't get it right here, it can't happen with these systems. It just cannot. And this is probably unsurprising coming from an abolitionist, right? That I'm like, well, It ain't going to be this. It's not going to be reform. So you just got to burn this thing down. So I don't want it to sound like a cop out. I'm still on the fence. And I say that as a person who is responsible for doing this work at the ACLU. I get it. Every single day. My team does the same. The 600 people that I work with at the national office do the same. The other 1,400 that we have in the affiliates, right? Because we're a 2,000 person organization all told. We're all doing the same thing. If we can't do it here, the system ain't built for it. And that's it. And I think it's okay for us to say that reform isn't going to get us there, because we sure as hell say that about our other systems, right? So why can't we hold ourselves to that same standard? So that's where I am on it. The jury's still out, pardon the legal metaphor, but the jury's still out on it. And I think that's okay. I think that we have to constantly be interrogating ourselves and our systems and the ways that we do our work. And if we come to understand that liberation is not possible with what we have here, we have to be willing to burn it down.
There's something really hopeful in just the way that you express that, in just thinking about how the systems can not be built for us, right? And if that's the case, we see it, we burn it down, right? I know we're almost at time, but we did want to squeeze in a D&I confession from you, if you can spare us 2 minutes. A D&I confession is where you can share with us anything that you've made a mistake on, that you felt embarrassed by, I can't believe I used to think that back in the day. David, do you want to do a quick one just so Amber can kind of get a sense of what a D&I confession is?
I got 10 of them all ready for you.
Go for it.
No, please go ahead, David. Rejoice.
Yeah, so, as we've shared as Connie and I have shared over the weeks, one of the things that has come to mind for me is like not being so hungry to do this work that you do it with people who aren't ready to go there, right? I think more in terms of like restorative justice, often in schools and organizations with people who might like the words, but not be ready to do the work. And in the position of like an outside facilitator, just being hungry to I just want to share this with you. It'll be great. It'll change your life. And then you get to the space and people are like, no, what are you talking about? That's not what we wanted. And, everybody is saddened by that, right? The missed expectations. And so the importance of being really clear, getting common expectations, and from leaning back on something that you said earlier, Amber, right? Not compromising your values, right? And saying no, this is where I stand. And if you don't want to do this, then you can find somebody else to work with. That's okay. What about you?
Oh my gosh, there are so many, and I'm being so mindful of our time. I'll give, other than the confession that I don't know that these nonprofits are going to save us, and the ACLU is my life. I feel like that should count as a pretty big confession. But a time that I got it wrong. I think this is so important because I talked earlier about the importance of humility in this work and having grace for ourselves and each other. And so anytime I get an opportunity to talk about mistakes that I make, I want to do that. I want to preface by saying I make mistakes in my work every single day. And I think it's really important for D&I and practitioners to admit that. If we don't have the ability to be called in, to be called forward, then I don't know how the hell we expect that from anybody else. So I just want to name that. And I'm grateful to the folks that I surround myself with that trust me enough to call me in, and that I can trust enough to call me in, because that kind of calling in and calling forward is a gift, truly. People don't have to give you that labor. So that's my quick preamble to this. The quickest way that I can tell this story, and this is a very vulnerable story to tell, and I don't think I've told it anywhere before. So this is kind of back to David's point of we don't really want this. That's the theme of this. So this happened back in April. And we at the ACLU we are constantly responding to crisis, right? People know this about us. We are actually best in a crisis. And so what happens when there is a particular crisis is that we have whole teams that go and deal with it externally. And then my team and I deal with the internal response. So for instance, trigger warning for violence and anti-Blackness and violence against Black folks. If there is a police murder of a Black person, right? And this is huge news. There are obviously many of our racial justice teams, our advocacy teams that will run out and our comms teams will run out and do what we need to do on the ground to address it. Our teams in the affiliate wherever this tragedy happens. And then internally, we get to work on caring for our staff who are, again, like on front lines doing this work and then dealing with the vicarious trauma from doing this work all the time. And so sometimes it looks like an email, a statement, but more often it looks like actual substantive space that we are holding for folks to be able to show up. And when I say folks, it's like the folks that are most impacted. So in this case, our Black ERGs, our Black employee resource groups, would get together and hold space for Black staff to be able to authentically feel how they're feeling. If that is rage, if it is sadness, whatever, we hold that space for that community. And there may also be additional spaces for allies and accomplices, and folks can opt into that. But it is principally important for us to have a space for the community. That context is important because in April, when we were seeing the absolutely disgusting, catastrophic rise of anti-Asian violence, we kind of deployed the same response. And so what happened, I'm sorry, it was February through April, but what really happened towards the end of February is this is when the uptick was really starting to make kind of massive national news, right? And so my team and I started working on our internal response, which included an email that was going to go out, start building spaces, et cetera, and our external folks were doing their work. We worked through, I remember we worked through President's Day weekend, and we had our statement, and we were ready after President's Day weekend to send a draft statement to our AAPI employee resource group. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to use so many acronyms that's not accessible. So our Asian American Pacific Islander employee resource groups. We took, as we often do, on the labor of doing the first draft because our communities who were directly impacted are experiencing a particular trauma, and we don't want to put labor on them and say, hey, do you want to draft this thing for all staff? That's not usually the process that we use. Here's what happened. While we were writing and building and doing all of this, our communities were in pain. And we hadn't reached out to them. We were doing all this for the employee resource group and hadn't talked to the employee resource group. At the same time, the employee resource group is like, nobody said anything to us. We're feeling like we're an island over here. We are deeply traumatized. We're in pain. What the hell's going on? And so, as our people do, they started writing a letter to us to call us in about essentially forgetting them. By the time we get to them, they are understandably inflamed. And they come at us, right? My team, me, to say that you essentially abandoned us, right? And we're coming to them at the same time to be like, hey, look at this thing for you all to review and all of this stuff that we planned and did so you didn't have to carry this labor while you were. And it did not go well. To David's point, this is not what we wanted, right? Or maybe it is, but you didn't ask. And really what we wanted was you to check in and see if we were okay, because we're not. And I fucked it up. Like, we fucked it up. And it was the first time in my career where I was the subject of a restorative process. And so I was grateful to be called into a process for how my kind of rapid response and my good intentions had actually further harmed a community that was already in pain and trauma. And looking back, it could be that what we put together was exactly what was needed, but we missed a few critical steps. And it didn't actually matter what the product was on the other end because we didn't check in with the folks who were most impacted. And so I give that very vulnerable story to say, we all have a lot of learning to do, a lot of growing to do. And it is as hard as it was to receive that feedback at the time. I'm grateful for it. It's made my practice better. It's made our work internally better. And we also have new policies and flowcharts for how we reach out to communities, because we need to have all of this concretized, because when these things happen, everybody at the ACLU runs in 1,000 different directions. And instead of just running in those directions, we need to be thinking about the people that we're trying to hold space for and center. So that is my very vulnerable answer to your question.
Yeah. Thank you, Amber.
Thank you so much for trusting us with that. What comes out is that sense of urgency to do for instead of doing things with, right? And it all comes back to those relationships that we build every single day. You've given us more than the time that you'd said that you would, and so we're so very grateful. Where can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
Oh, that's such a wonderful question. So folks can follow. I'm on the social medias. So check me out on LinkedIn and on Twitter and Instagram, and I guess Facebook. I don't really do anything there. And certainly follow the ACLU. We're doing some really incredible work, and we're coming up on legislative session, so we are going to really need folks help. These are some of the most challenging legislative sessions for voting rights, for trans rights, for reproductive rights, like we really, racial justice, of course. So we really need all hands on deck. So follow us and we will tell you how to get involved because we need you.
Definitely. And if you want to hear more of Amber in your ears, you're also hosting the ACLU's podcast for now. So we'll definitely get that linked in the show notes as well. Again, thank you so much, Amber.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a pleasure.
Woo! Oh man, I love talking to Amber, or even just being in the presence of her storytelling. She shared so vulnerably. There were so many takeaways. Connie, what stood out to you?
Yeah. First of all, I just wanted to give a big shout out and thank you again to Amber, because I think that there was so much energy and dynamicness. It just felt like a really dynamic conversation. And even though often when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, or justice work of any kind, it can feel, as she said, like doom and gloom, I felt like the conversation she was leading for us and weaving together was actually quite hopeful. And I really appreciated that. So I think what really stood out for me, and I know we didn't get a chance to, or I didn't get a chance to share my confession because of our lack of time, is I really love what Amber said about essentially disposability politics, right? Like where as people who are in the movement, whether we are in community organizing or grassroots coalition building, or even if we're diversity, equity, inclusion practitioners, we are still lacking the practice, the patience, the intention or willingness to call each other in gently when there is harm, mistakes, or anything that we should own and take responsibility for. And I love what she said about how, she was kind of thinking about like, how many people did I turn away from this movement that could have actually been really powerful as partners? And when she shared that, I actually started to think about how in my earlier days of doing diversity, equity, inclusion work, I was mostly call out rather than call in. And so my colleagues, people I worked with, even friends and family, I felt like I did turn some people away from the movement. I feel regretful of. And I think that, part of that is just what you and I, David, talk about often is the relationships, right? Like, and part of it could be that like I wasn't ready to call people in because there wasn't that relationship built or a sense of trust built. And so it's not to say we should always call people in gently, because sometimes there just isn't that safety or that trust. But I do think about like, rather than disposing people, like how are we actually inviting people into this work more expansively? What about you, David?
Yeah, I think just piggybacking off of that, y'all know I ride for restorative justice all day. And so when Amber was talking about how they started their restorative inclusion processes as, processes responding to egregious harm, but then really showing people like, through either conversations or feedback or like providing psychological safety as the way that they framed it, like building those equitable, trusting relationships from the jump and giving people the practices to navigate conflict and harm so it doesn't escalate all the way to like, F you, you're canceled, is so important, right? And so as a restorative justice practitioner, do I have the ability and can I teach folks to navigate like that conflict and harm? Absolutely. And it is much more, to lean into white supremacy language, efficient use of time to do that proactive education that she was talking about around how to create those environments for safety, right? Going back to, the things that she was sharing earlier in the conversation about making sure that everybody is on the same page. We have common language across demographics, whether that is race, generations, with age, right? And just different life experiences is also a really important thing to do within the context of your work, whether you are in-house or a consultant, making sure that everybody is speaking the same language will help us go so far.
Yes. And if we can give one major starting tip, if you are starting out on DEI work or any kind of work around justice, equity, inclusion, belonging, fill in the blanks, it's to build that common language. So really enjoy the conversation with Amber. Are there any last words from you, David?
No, I mean, I just feel like, hey, go back and re-listen to the stories, re-listen to those ideas, because there was some powerful stuff in there. And as always, you can reach back out to us. Tell us what stood out to you at revolutionorreform@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening. We'll be back with another episode next time. We'd also love to hear from you. Is D&I revolution or reform? Send us your thoughts and juicy DEI confessions as a voice memo or text to revolutionorreform@gmail.com.
Make sure you're subscribed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And while you're at it, leave us a rating or review and share this with a friend, old school, or with Karen at work. Later, y'all.
Bye.